Hello, welcome to all of those who've joined us. Sorry if there's been a slightly technical issue there, but I think we've solved that. I think we're all with you now, so hoping you can all see and hear us. Um, so as we're already at 5 past the hour, let's get underway. Thanks for joining us for this Ember webinar on clean flexibility. My name's Richard Black. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy for Ember. And over the next hour, we're going to be exploring what clean flexibility is, why it matters, and what's going on at this year's UN Climate Summit that's helping to put clean flexibility on the map. And joining me are four people who've all got a lot of expertise in this field, and we look forward to hearing from them in a minute. So we have two people from Ember, based in the Asia region and working in Asia. Neshwin Rodriguez, who's an electricity policy analyst based in India. Dr. Dinita Setiawati, who's a senior electricity policy analyst based in Indonesia. And we're also delighted to be joined by Gabrielle Kuiper, from Australia, who's a director at the Superpower Institute and a distributed energy resources specialist at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and by Putra Adepuna, who's a managing director at the Energy Shift Institute, who's joining us from Bandung, Indonesia. So what is clean flexibility? Well, one of the ways that it's being described, which I find quite intuitively appealing, is that if you've got an energy system that's powered by wind and solar with other renewables playing a role, then you can regard those as the heart, if you like, or the muscles of the system. And clean flexibility is the brain that allows that energy to be distributed when and where it's needed. And at Ember, we're starting to talk in terms of there being four ways that you can do this. So you can store the energy so that you can then release it when it's needed. You can shift the time at which the energy is actually needed so that you start reducing the peaks of demand and spread demand to times when generation is plentiful. You can share it between regions, between countries, and so on. And then you can look at the supply side and how to make that flexible, and also make sure that if you do need to be burning fossil fuels, then you can do so in a way that is clean. So I think the direction of travel with the energy system at the moment is clearly towards a system that's based on wind and solar power, with electricity replacing fossil fuels in things like motoring and heating and industry. We may be at the beginning of that transition in many countries, but that does seem to be undeniably the way that we're going. So this is quite an important issue. So what's happening this year that's putting this on the map? Well, very soon, we're going to have the United Nations Climate Summit, COP29, which begins in Baku in Azerbaijan in the early November. And the presidency of the COP, the Azerbaijani presidency, have issued a number of pledges that they would like governments to sign up to, and indeed not just governments, but other institutions as well. And there are three things on the agenda there that are quite interesting from the flexibility point of view. So they're suggesting that governments agree a target of having 1,500 gigawatts of energy storage in place by the end of this decade. By the same point, they're suggesting that government should have built or refurbished 25 million kilometers of grid. And they also want to get something underway on green hydrogen. And one of the uses of hydrogen, sorry, clean hydrogen, I should say, not green hydrogen. One of the uses of hydrogen can be to use for electricity generation at times when there isn't enough from every other source. So this is the first time that we've had this issue on the agenda at one of the UN climate conferences. So it seemed to us a good time to explore why this is and what it means, and also whether it's achievable, and look at some examples from around the world of where this is actually happening. So let me move to our first speaker, Neshwin Rodriguez, Ember's analyst based in India. Neshwin, can you tell us, first of all, a little bit about these targets? Why are we looking at 1,500 gigawatts? Why is that the target? And how about the grid's target? How did they come into being?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think the significance, I'll start with the storage targets, right? So the significance, I think, of the 6x increase in, global storage capacity from the 2022 level to around 1500 gigawatts, I think is essentially to support the tripling of renewable capacity target, right? By 2030, the IEA suggests that for every 8 gigawatts of VRE in the grid, approximately 1 gigawatt of storage is required to balance temporarily the VRE supply as well as demand. Now in term so renewables so far have been integrated with minimum amount of storage, right? But as the VRE penetration increases, storage could actually be a limiting factor. So that is why I think we are now looking at separate targets for storage, and I think the IEA has showed the importance of battery storage in particular.
Yeah,
In terms of, I think in terms of grid targets, that is a target to add or refurbish around 80 million kilometers of grid infrastructure by 2040. I think the significance of that is quite clear. I mean, it's clear that grid delays could potentially slow down the pace of VRE uptake, especially in countries where we are now seeing the ramp up of solar and wind additions. And we've already seen this happening in some countries, like, for example, the US, where the inability to have capacity to add VRE to the grid has actually acted as a major bottleneck in VRE additions. The thing is, it takes almost a year longer to build transmission lines as compared to RE. So these targets for grids are likely meant to, think of grid expansion not as a reaction to RE uptake, but something more like a precursor to ramping VRE. So instead of responding to connection requests, the planning should focus on anticipating future needs, particularly through VRE.
yeah, it's interesting. And there's one little change to the target here from what the International Energy Agency proposed. They proposed 80 million kilometers, as you were saying, by 2040, Neshwin, and the COP presidency has translated this to let's get going right now and have 25 million kilometers by 2030. So they obviously want things to get going quickly. Now, you were referring to the fact that lack of storage could be an issue that could limit the deployment of variable renewable energy, VRE, onto the grid. And your own work in India has shown up the critical significance of having enough storage and having enough storage quickly. Could you take us briefly through the conclusions?
Yeah, so a bit of starting with a bit of context on this. So solar currently in India has has the largest portion of the VRE installed, and currently caters to largely only meeting demand during solar hours. Uh, our modeling suggests that in the future, and the year that we're looking at is 2032. What we would see is that the share of VRE during the day increases quite substantially. We see up to 85% of electricity demand being met by VRE during the day in some months, but it is only around 38% during the night. So the question here is, how do we meet nighttime demand, right? This question becomes really important. It is going to be either through coal or storage. So storage could be a constraining factor when it comes to growth of VRE, especially once solar inches closer to the 20-25% share in total generation. And because of this, battery costs become extremely important in the Indian context, right? What our results say is that in an optimal scenario where India builds the optimal levels of RE, which entail it to add much more than it has been adding, and if battery costs continue to decrease in the way they have, we could potentially see plateauing in coal generation by the year 2032. And at least that would be the cost-effective pathway for India. Even uh, I mean, we've seen that even at current battery prices, meeting some portion of non-solar demand through solar charged batteries is actually cost effective. This is I'm saying this particularly because of the results of the FDRE tenders, which have solar plus battery storage. But
FDRE, these are firm tenders for renewable energy. So you can't just,
yes.
yeah, you're not allowed to supply intermittent energy. It has to be consistent.
Right, right. But our modeling also suggests that there are scenarios in which India could build up to 72 gigawatts of coal power plants more, which is something to keep an eye out of on. But to actually limit the addition of new coal capacity, battery costs would have to actually reduce by half of what they are currently. And for this to happen, that is to limit new coal capacity additions by 2030, we would need a 15% annual reduction in battery costs.
That's
Uh,
excellent. And it really shows graphically the importance of having storage on the system, doesn't it? So that you can actually make this energy transition successfully. And just briefly, Neshwin, before we come on to the other panelists, what else is going to be necessary for India and South Asia beyond batteries? What other flexibility mechanisms are going to be needed?
I think the most important in terms of priority would be to ensure that the current coal fleet is flexible. It can ramp up, ramp down on time. The mechanisms where they can recover the additional cost because of the change in heat rate and wear and tear of equipments are in place. So that's the first. I think demand response could also be important. Battery costs are currently at 4.2 rupees, which means that that much amount of that's the cost of shifting 1 unit of electricity from solar to non-solar. So there is a lot of potential for demand response in the country. And I think also better sharing of the existing coal capacity and thinking about the mechanisms for better sharing of the existing coal capacity to prevent building new coal capacity as much as possible and to prevent those lock-ins.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much. And just to say to everyone who's on the call, we'd love to take your comments and your questions. So if you do have any, please type them into the Q&A box whenever you like. And we'll either get to them as we go through or we'll deal with them at the end of the session. So the Q&A box, please, as soon as you like. Let me pass on to now to Dr. Dinita Setiawati, Senior Electricity Policy Analyst with Ember, based in Southeast Asia. So these targets for COP29, Dinita, they sound quite ambitious, don't they? Scaling up the amount of storage by sixfold just by the end of the decade in 6 years' time, and investment in enough grid cabling that you could stretch it around the Earth more than 600 times just by the end of the decade. But are they really ambitious? Could they be done? How does it compare to what we have now?
Yes, thank you, Richard. So, stretching the cable around the Earth 600 times does seem ambitious, but actually, every year, some countries, especially in Southeast Asia, invest in grid cabling and more transmission lines already. So, 100% electricity access is still the main priority for Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as a regional entity. And then as for storage, we're seeing an increase in storage planning in ASEAN, shaped by the region's push for leveraging the critical mineral resources and also with the EV growth and securing energy storage solutions. So there are a lot of development in the battery energy storage system in the region. For example, Indonesia recently launched its first electric vehicle battery plant in West Java, and there's also the largest BESS in the region set to start developed in Malaysia Sabah. And then similar other deployments are also underway in the Philippines. And, there's also Singapore's agreement with Indonesia to export about 2 gigawatt solar plus 8 gigawatt of utility scale BESS joint venture, which highlight the importance of grid connections between those countries.
Yes, and that takes us on to the next question I wanted to ask you, Danita, grid connections. Your own work has been looking at Southeast Asia, hasn't it, as a region, and the importance of having interconnection between countries across the region. What sort of benefits would that bring if governments did increase the rate of interconnection between countries?
Yes, research. So definitely interconnections is one of the main hot topics in ASEAN energy discussions, and from last year throughout to this year, and in latest Ember report on ASEAN, we highlighted the interconnections and how regional power connectivity could bring benefits for the regions. For example, it could incentivize much needed private investment for large-scale power projects. And then there's also the benefits of lower decarbonization costs and emission reductions by optimizing the energy system. But I think most importantly, imagine ASEAN is the one big interconnected power system. So of course, it will improve access to cleaner electricity powered by wind and solar, as shown in the Ember reports, where we see the seasonal complementary between wind and solar following the ASEAN power grid in the report and deliver economic benefits. But most importantly, and I think this is a very useful argument for policymakers. In ASEAN, everyone is talking about energy security, and energy security. So interconnections for ASEAN countries will definitely bring more energy security and more equitable sharing of resources between countries with high renewable energy potentials and countries with restrained potential like Singapore or Brunei.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? In the context of the climate COPs, people talk about the decarbonisation potential, but you're absolutely right. You've mentioned two other issues there that are crucially important, particularly across the global south, aren't they? Energy security and energy access. Now, of course, any government can do anything it wants at any time in terms of its own targets. But for this global target, if Southeast Asian governments do sign up to the target on storage and the target on grids, what do you think the impact of that would be in Southeast Asia? Will it stimulate investment? Will it stimulate progress?
Yes, so I think it is important, and maybe it will bring more benefits if the Southeast Asian countries sign up to this COP agreement collectively as a region, because we do have the ASEAN Power Grid Master Plan anyway. And I also think that Southeast Asia, with the COP agreement or without the COP, is gearing up to be more interconnected in the next coming years. So there have been discussions about this interconnection since the 1990s, and then studies about the economic benefits the interconnection would bring, stimulating of investment, has been definitely all out there. And then especially the main point is that Singapore is preparing to decarbonize the economy by 2050. And this is the main point, because Singapore is actually going to be the one that could stimulate faster renewable energy deployment in the regions, and also faster interconnections between the regions, because Singapore is looking to procure renewable energy from its neighboring countries. So yes, Richard, definitely interconnection is a game changer for ASEAN energy transitions, and it should be a powerful motivator too for private sector investment to invest more in the region.
Great, thanks, Denisa. It's great. We have one question for you already, which we'll come back to at the end. And just a reminder to everybody, if you any questions or points you'd like to make, please do type them into the Q&A box, and we look forward to answering those later on. Let me pass on to our third speaker now, Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper, who's director at the Superpower Institute in Australia. Gabrielle, particularly interested to hear what's been going on in South Australia, the state of South Australia, which seems to be one of the regions in the world that is moving fastest towards this vision of a smart, flexible energy system with renewables acting as the brain and flexibility mechanism. Sorry, renewables acting as the heart and the muscles, and flexibility acting as the brain. Tell us how it's all working.
Thanks, Richard. South Australia is quite a remarkable story, because 17 years ago, it had no renewables. And last year, 75% of generation for the state of that population of about 1.8 million people was from variable renewables, just wind and solar, no hydro. And they are aiming to be 100% variable renewables by 2027. What's even more remarkable is almost 50% of households, 1 in 2 homes in South Australia, have rooftop solar, And so we're seeing times in the middle of the day where more than 100% of electricity demand from those 1.8 million people is being met by rooftop solar alone. And the reason it's more than 100% of demand is they're actually exporting those solar generated electrons to the neighbouring state of Victoria. So Victoria is an incredible story about how fast you can make the transition happen if you set your mind to it. The other things to say about South Australia is that there is no coal generation anymore. Nashwin made the very good point about coal generators starting to flex, which we're seeing in other parts of Australia. But the flexibility at the moment is being provided by a number of things in South Australia. It's being provided by gas substantially, especially when there's very little wind at times overnight. Obviously, there's no solar. It's being provided by batteries. Some people on the call might know there was a famous bet in South Australia between Mike Cannon-Brookes, who's a software founder of a company called Atlassian, and Elon Musk that started on Twitter and resulted in the world's largest battery at the time being installed in South Australia. That battery now looks tiny. The latest announcement by a company called Neoen is for a battery to be installed in South Australia that's 8 times the largest battery in the system currently. It's 3.6 gigawatt hours. So batteries are a big part of the story, but we're also seeing a lot of other types of flexible demand, particularly shifting hot water, household appliances, and some commercial and industrial uses into the day when we have that abundant solar generation. So it's a fascinating story, South Australia, and we're all looking forward to it having an entire year being 100% net renewables powered, but it already last year they were at 75%. So it's up there essentially with Denmark as one of the jurisdictions in the world that's managing such a high proportion of variable renewables from wind and solar in ways that probably everyone on the call would remember 10 years ago, everyone said, that's impossible. You cannot possibly do that.
Yes, it's interesting to trawl back, isn't it? And call up all those times when people have said X and X penetration of renewables is impossible. And then 10 years later, as you say, there it is. So it's really this mix, is it, of battery storage and demand shifting and a bit of interconnection that's enabled this renewables penetration to go from, or variable renewables penetration to go from 0 up to the 75% that we're seeing now.
Yes, and obviously the gas plays a role. We're hoping, obviously, over time, in the interest of emissions reduction, that reduces. But at the moment, it is an important balancing component.
So what are some of the key policies, the key measures that have been put in place in South Australia that have enabled this to happen?
So we did see in South Australia some significant battery subsidies and the very first virtual power plant trials. Now, interestingly, you talked at the beginning about how flexibility has lots of different dimensions. The first, in fact, the very large battery that resulted from the bet between Elon Musk and Mike Cannon-Brookes and the virtual power plant trials, they didn't actually produce substantial storage in terms of feeding back into the grid for supply. Their focus was on frequency control and ancillary services. So the first role that batteries have played and continue to play in the grid has been in providing those ancillary services. And what has been fascinating is, of course, there was a substantial first mover advantage there because our ancillary services prices, especially in South Australia, were very high, and the batteries have come down and brought down those prices, which obviously brings down prices for consumers. We're now seeing batteries. Another major initiative has been the network operator, South Australian Power Networks, has developed what they call a solar sponge tariff. So between 10 a.m. in the morning and 3 p.m. in the afternoon, if you're purchasing electricity from the grid, then you pay a quarter of the network tariff that you would normally do. Now, that's only the network tariff, but in most of Australia, that distribution network tariff is about 40% of a household bill. So there's a financial incentive there for households to move their usage to the daytime. And also what we've seen is that a lot of the households that have put solar on their roofs have moved their hot water system with a timer and a diverter such that it can soak up the solar generated electricity during the day to heat their hot water. And we can talk more about hot water, but I'm very passionate about it. I think it's a major unappreciated source of flexible demand. It's, you know, it's not smart, sexy, new technology. It's not glamorous, a hot water system, but it's a very, very important part of the balancing flexible demand that we need.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. Are other parts of Australia, or indeed the Australian federal government, are they looking at this example and saying, let's do something similar?
So in fact, the Australian federal government has a target for our entire national electricity market, which confusingly for people outside Australia only applies to the East Coast, but basically where most of the population lives, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, and those coastal regions. The federal government's target is 82% renewables by 2030. There's a lot of movement to getting to that. And there's also a big commitment by our market operator to be able to operate the system with 100% variable renewables by 2025. So it's really interesting to see, again, what was told it was impossible, but the market operator is preparing for periods. We've got a 5-minute settlement period, which is obviously very short, but also very beneficial if you're the owner or operator of a solar or wind farm. So it will be 5 minutes first for 100% variable renewables, and then we'll expand on and eventually obviously get to a full year. But there's a whole variety of government support for the renewables deployment, for large-scale batteries. Most of the developers we're seeing now, particularly of solar farms, are not just simply installing solar farms because that's not economic. You need the battery to do the shifting to other times of day. And I think that's one of the interesting things about we're now talking about flexibility. There was such a focus historically of more renewable supply, but that's only part of the story. For the full picture for decarbonisation, we have to have the storage, we have to have the EVs, we have to have the flexible commercial, industrial and residential demand to go with it if we're really, particularly to reduce the cost of the transition.
And just one final question, Gabrielle, before I come on to our fourth guest. What sort of benefits is this transition to clean flexibility? What benefits is that actually bringing to the people in South Australia?
So obviously there are, about almost 1 million people that have solar on the roof, and their bills are a lot lower than they used to be because of that rooftop solar. And everyone's bills are lower from the reduced cost of the wholesale prices, which were traditionally quite high in South Australia. One of the reasons for the high adoption of rooftop solar in South Australia was the historically high electricity prices there. And I think the other thing to say about, there are some cost reductions, but this story is not over yet. In fact, the government of South Australia want to go beyond 100% renewables. So they are looking at the development of large-scale renewables to do things like green ammonia, potentially green iron. There's all of the export industries that can be developed off the back of having a state with fantastic renewable resources and having such a experience and commercial pipeline of developing large-scale renewable projects as well as obviously there's a lot of distributed energy resources in the system there too.
Right. Thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, one of the things I personally find fascinating about the South Australian journey is that a lot of this happened under a national government that was absolutely committed to coal, and yet here we have the smart, flexible grid taking place in South Australia. Let me come on now to our fourth guest, Putra Adiguna, who's a managing director at the Energy Shift Institute in Indonesia. And Putra, we've just heard a very compelling example of how adding flexibility to wind and solar can produce a whole range of benefits, including lower bills and so on. Why do you think what's happening in Australia is quite slow at the moment to sort of take off in for example, in Southeast Asia?
So yeah, thanks for the question, Richard. I think firstly, I need to say that Southeast Asia is not a single country. So it's always difficult when people ask this question, you know, it's basically so many different regulatory market, even electricity prices. So if we look at it from the flexibility side, I think we're still in that state where there's just different level of integration of the VRE into the system. So you have countries which have, you know, VRE integration in the order of 15% and somebody as low as 1%. So within these different countries, obviously, the interest in exploring the flexibility differs as well. We're seeing some progress, you know, whether it's on the pump hydro, for example, or whether it's on the battery side. There seems to be more progress that is happening in countries like Philippines, expectedly, because for some of you who are less familiar, Philippines is more a liberalized market within the Southeast Asian electricity market, and they got quite a bit of a battery capacity as a storage there. So yeah, so you're saying something? So I think that's we're still at a very early stage at this moment, but I think the interest is getting there, and I think it's important to us finding the nuances between the countries as well. Dinita mentioned a little bit about Singapore plans to import some of the electricity from Southeast Asian countries. That will be interesting because a big part of that is actually batteries. So they just don't want to ask about give us X 100 megawatt of solar. They basically ask X 100 megawatt of firm capacity. So I think we're going to see a lot more capacity of flexibility moving forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Thinking about the sort of system itself, not just on a national basis, but on an international basis as well. One of the things I think that's happened in China is you've got the domestic markets and domestic policies that expand adoption of wind and solar and batteries and so on, and big grid expansion. And that's tied up with the development of Chinese industry as well. So Chinese industry is making the things and they're being deployed in the country as well. Is this something that is likely to prove attractive to governments or some governments in Southeast Asia? This idea that you can build the industry by actually domestic policies for deploying renewables and flexibility?
Yeah, for sure. So there is actually a lot of uptick in, for example, you know, solar PV manufacturing, which is actually interestingly is driven by two different factors. Factor number one is domestic demand as well, but factor number two, as we know that the US and China has a bit of a tension within that trade, you know, between exporting solar PVs from Chinese factories, for example. So this actually picks up a lot of manufacturing of clean energy technologies within the Southeast Asian region as well. Now, we do need to keep in mind that ultimately these technologies are not easy technologies to adopt. So it's really about finding that, you know, fine balance between working some partner to cooperate with, whether it's from China, Japan, or other advanced economies to establish something. We're seeing a lot of progress, whether it's Malaysia, you know, Vietnam and Indonesia. It's slowly start to build, you know, from something as basic as, for example, let's gather the quartz, let's start building, you know, some polysilicon. You know, it's still very early stage. But I think, again, what is interesting is that the drivers of these will not be solely on domestic Southeast Asian demands, but also in trying to create an industry as an export market as well for Southeast Asia.
Interesting. And Gabriel was also talking about the potential to do, for example, green ammonia or green steel in Australia. And I suppose in the Indonesian context as well, where there's quite a lot of manufacturing, if you move to a clean power system, then manufacturing of these goods can become clean itself, which could be quite an advantage on international markets.
True. It's probably going to take some time because if we're talking about India already has quite a big of a steel industry as well. Southeast Asia is of a much lesser degree, But what you're saying is correct, is that I think right now countries are realizing that there is no way to accept the transition moving forward, right? When people want to build new coal plants, they may find it very difficult, which means that there is only one way out, which is you move forward and try to get through the transition. It's not going to be easy, right? As we mentioned, that Southeast Asia is comprised of vastly different countries, market structures, electricity price, for example. You're looking at some countries with 7 cents per kilowatt hours, others is running at 25 cents per kilowatt hours. Those divergent situation will obviously be of incentives. I think Singapore will probably going to be quite ahead in terms of some industrial development, just out of their ability to afford some of these technologies. But what they do can actually nudge where Southeast Asia is heading. Because when Singapore's industries want to move forward, it's going to have to source their energies elsewhere as well. So it will be interesting. And I think a lot of countries and economies in here are realizing that transition is your only options, and it will have to be moving one step ahead.
And finally, let's look a little bit further into the future. So for 2030 now, we have on a global basis the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity. We probably will have after this COP the goal of a 6-fold increase in energy storage and the start of a grid expansion program. But 2030 is actually not that far away, and it's not the target date for most countries' net zero plans. So where do you think we're going to go with flexibility after 2030?
So I think what's important is actually, in addition to this big goals, is actually looking at the near-term targets of many of these countries, right? Obviously, governments like to sign on many things, but I think what is more important for these governments to actually sign on the near-term targets. And I think that is very important. And I don't actually see a lot of these discussion happening, or maybe I'm just not keeping track of it. People tend to be obsessed with 20-year target, while as we know, most government doesn't last more than 5 years. So I think it's going to be important to actually see, okay, now that you signed the 2030s or the 2060s, what are your near term? And as you said, 2030 is not a long time, and trying to keep track of what's going to happen within the next 2 to 3 years is important. In terms of flexibility, again, I think given the various level of VR integration, each countries will be running at their own pace, whether we like it or not, because obviously right now, most of the discussion is still really centered on power generation. Now, one quick point about this is that in many markets, this generation-centered attention can be unproductive because you have a lot of state-owned utilities that's basically responsible for managing the grid, and they may ultimately say, well, you have all this money pouring into the generations, how about us, right? Can we get more support? So I think there needs to be more attention on the grid companies, because otherwise what is a possibility is that some state grid may just decide, let's pick out a more stable power, whether it's nuclear, whether it's something else that may take another 10 to 15 years to develop. So again, in summary, I think each market will run differently, but more attention will be needed and financing will be needed on the grid, which means that the power companies should not only be generation centered, but more attention on the grid will be required.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. That's lovely. Let's we've got about 15 minutes left, and we'd love to hear your questions and your comments. So please do type them in the Q&A box, and we would be delighted to come to them. Danita, question for you from Ridvan Korniawan. How much cross-border interconnection and grid flexibility discourse in ASEAN? How could this help in bringing more variable renewables plus battery storage than excess coal capacity in the cross-border power trade?
Okay, so thank you very much, Ridwan, for your questions. So I think in terms of grid connections and grid flexibility discourse, the discourse has been focused mostly on low carbon electricity trade. So by low carbon, I mean they have agreement to bring in solar and BESS and wind, hydropower, and possibly gas between Malaysia and Singapore and other countries. So, and the main point about interconnections is actually decarbonizations. So VRE or wind and solar are the most sense energy technologies to play a role in this trading system. And then we also seen from the current first multilateral power trade in ASEAN, which is the LTMS PIP, the Laos, Thai, Malaysia, Singapore power integration projects, in which Singapore import hydropower from Laos, but because of there's this climate or seasonal implications, there was some decline in hydropower generations, and so there was also some like changes to the import capacity. So I think here solar, particularly, and battery could play a bigger role in ensuring that the interconnections and the import capacity are being fulfilled.
Great. Thanks, Donita. Yes, as I say, if you've got any more questions or comments, please do put them in the box. Neshwin, I wanted to, if I may, pick up with you one of the points that Putra Udiguna was talking about, which was the sort of grid companies and so on. And I guess we might be in a situation where private capital is interested in one element of this flexibility build, perhaps batteries or something like this, but actually you do need quite a lot of state intervention in order to get other bits, such as grid expansion, underway.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that, right? So yeah, it depends on what part of the system is more suitable for private investment as compared to others. In terms of, I think grid, particularly transmission, for example, we've had it difficult to get in private money to build those networks, and it's mostly been, at least in India, it has mostly been driven by government companies. And I think in terms of the the logic for that, I think first of all, when you're talking about building a transmission line, right, you're talking about getting land clearance in parcels that would stretch a long length, right? So you're it is not like one patch of land, right? You'll have multiple owners which you'd have to kind of interact with and so on. In terms of the policies that govern land acquisition for transmission, they're quite different from those that govern land acquisition for RE projects as well. Again, I'm talking mostly from the Indian context. So yeah, the natural suitability for whether it is a private company or a public company that does transmission and renewables, I think, is defined by all these things.
Yeah, thanks. How has this happened in Australia, Gabriel, in South Australia? Like, has there been this mixture of private capital and state backing for the transition?
Yeah, it's a complicated one, definitely a mixture of both, and it's varied as well between the large scale and the small scale. Just briefly on the small scale, we have had this thing known as the solar coaster, where government support and tariffs have waxed and waned. And so for quite a long time there was a variability in the construction of the rooftop solar as well as a variability in their generation. But at the large scale, we started with a federal renewable energy target, and then the states came in and a lot of them brought in their own schemes as well. Now we've got a sort of a hybrid mixture of support, and it really varies in in the Australian Capital Territory. They initiated the first reverse auctions. In the Australian Capital Territory, I should say it's only about 300,000 people, but they're 100% renewable as a result of their territory government taking action there. So it really has been a mix. But the one that's often forgotten is that because we've got over 3 million households that have invested in rooftop solar, that investment now totals more than $25 billion. And people kind of think rooftop solar, no one in an investment bank ever thinks of household rooftop solar as an investment class, right? It can't be packaged up in the way that people normally think about energy investments. But all of these small decisions by households, and also I should say increasingly by businesses, have really added up to a significant amount of household capital investment as well. And I should say that's now moving into batteries. So 1 in every 5 homes in Australia in the last year that put solar on their roof also installed a battery, even though it's, sort of looking at 7 to 10 year return. So it's not being done for, financial reasons largely, but it's being done because those households are particularly preparing for the future if they've got an EV or something like that. And we're also seeing some electrification of households and households installing heat pump hot water systems, as well as heat pump heating and cooling systems as well. So the household investment, really wanted to just emphasize that as well, has also been really significant. It's not just been, private capital of, the large scale kind, or government subsidies of the large scale kind. It has been those very different mix of different types of investments.
Now, in the context of the UN climate negotiations, and particularly this year, we shouldn't let this go without talking a little bit about international climate finance and the support that is supposed to flow from developed countries to developing countries, because one of the major topics for discussion at this year's COP is a new goal, basically, that should increase the amount of support that's flowing in that direction. So Putra, maybe I can put this to you. If there were to be some kind of escalation in the amount of money that is available for countries such as Indonesia to help with the clean energy transition, how could that best be deployed in the context of building out flexibility rather than just building more solar and so on? How could it help, do you think?
Yeah, tough questions. But I think interconnections would be one. And this comes back to what Dinita was mentioning. Many countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, is highly fragmented just by this archipelago nature of it, right? And even like in Indonesia, about 80% of the electricity demand comes from a single island amongst 13,000, or amongst 5 main islands. So I think interconnecting the resources would be important as a starting point. Again, I think it will take time to actually grow renewables, because the last thing you want to do is build interconnections, but then those interconnections get used to transfer coal power from one island to another island. So that's probably not going to be a good one. So that's probably one.
Yes, that's an interesting one. Is it particularly going back to the point that private investment may not naturally flow quite so easily to grid expansion as it does to renewables and battery storage. Neshwin, I wondered if I could come back to you a bit, because often we talk about interconnection as being an international thing, but I'm guessing in a country as big as India, with such a diversity between the different provinces, the building of grids between provinces within the same country is just as important, maybe more important, than actually interconnection with neighboring countries.
Yeah, I think definitely more important, at least in the short term, right? So, for example, if there are no plans to build interconnections in the short term between countries, I think obviously connecting so for example, the Indian grid together as much as possible becomes extremely important. Also, naturally, we've seen, the sources of generation kind of changing, right? Like a lot of the solar power plants are coming in a state like Rajasthan, which traditionally did not have a lot of generation. So you would need to build all that evacuation infrastructure to take all the power or the solar power generated in Rajasthan to other load centers across the country. Similarly, some of the wind power plants in a state like in the southern state of Tamil Nadu have to be evacuated to other parts of the country. Yeah, I think in the short term, ensuring that you have enough so I kind of create the differentiation like this, right? Like you need first the evacuation infrastructure so that you can connect to the national grid. So you can get all the power to the national grid, and then you need the national grid or the regional grids to be strong enough to avoid any grid constraints that could create curtailment issues, right? So I think grid expansion at both these levels become extremely important.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. Let me come back to an issue that was raised in the Q&A box earlier, which was the flexibility of coal, which is something that Neshwin talked about in the Indian context, and I know is also featured in discourse in China. I'm guessing may have featured in discourse in Australia. How important has this been, and how easy is it to do this as opposed to building some storage and clean flexibility?
One of the things I love about working on the energy transition is that there are things that come in from left field that are not on your dance card that you cannot predict. Australia's got some of the oldest and dirtiest coal-fired power stations in the world. And if you told me that they were going to learn to flex significantly, I would have been like, maybe power plants in Asia that are only 5, 10, 15 years old, but we're talking about, 30, 40-year-old coal-fired power stations. But what is happening is that I talked about how we've got abundant solar during the middle of the day. What I didn't talk about is that our wholesale market goes down to negative $1,000 a megawatt hour, and we're seeing increasing negative price periods. So those owners of those coal-fired power stations are like, well, we've got the choice of paying to continue to generate, or we can learn how to flex. So that's been unexpected, but fantastic to see that that's possible, and think that that's a new and useful part of the transition. And I've forgotten the last part of your question.
About the sort of relative ease and the relative economic of doing it that way, as opposed to doing clean flexibility.
Yeah. So look, I think obviously you want to do clean flexibility first. I think this is very much an interim solution, especially because these coal-fired power stations are getting towards the end of their life. They're actually notorious for breaking down and for the number of outages that most of them are having on an annual basis. But it's very, very useful until such time as, particularly, we need in Australia a lot more EVs into the system. There's obviously potential of massive amounts of distributed storage if we can get electric vehicles not only to have managed charging, but potentially bidirectional charging and feeding back into the grid. So I see the coal-fired power stations very much as an interim solution as we wait for those sort of smarter, cleaner ways of doing things.
Yeah, thanks. It's also interesting to learn, seeing that the nuclear industry has also talked about load following. That's the discourse that's alive in France at the moment. Just looking at time, we're coming towards the end of the webinar, and I wondered if we might just look a little bit to the future. Let me ask you to fast forward sort of 10 years or so. Perhaps I can come to you first. If the COP target is adopted, and we have this global goal of increasing storage and increasing interconnection, and governments are implementing it and so on, where do you think Indonesia might be, for example, in 10 years' time? Might we be in this reality where batteries are being deployed and interconnections being deployed, and there's more demand shaving, and coal burning perhaps isn't needed quite so much?
I would imagine yes, because I think despite all the slowness that Indonesia has been having, I think we're approaching an inflection point just by the sheer fact that you can't build new coal plants. So I'd like to say that Indonesia's transition, like in many markets, is actually happening out of necessity and out of its economic competitiveness, just as opposed to being an emission reduction effort. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those kind of efforts within the next 5 to 10 years happening in many countries, where the discussion on the COP targets going to be widened into the economic discussions as well, because countries will need to stay competitive, and they don't have, again, the doors behind us has been closed. So the only way is actually to move forward. So I'm quite positive in saying that it will be better. It's probably going to take some time, but an inflection point is probably going to come.
And Neshwin, same question to you in the context of India and Southeast Asia. In 10 years' time, is the region inexorably going to be moving towards this clean, flexible future?
Yeah, I think it would have to, right? Like whether that flexibility comes from coal-based generation, we've seen a lot of battery storage coming in through the new tendering mechanisms, right? And people are, I mean, especially the industry is getting a hold of how to deal with such type of new tenders. I think all the building blocks seem to be there. It's all about ensuring that you get those capacity up. I mean, when capacity is in the renewable and storage capacity up as soon as possible to avoid that additional coal buildup and coal generation.
Great. Well, we are out of time, so it only remains for me to thank our four guests, Putra Adiguna from the Energy Shift Institute, Gabriel Kuiper from the Superpower Institute in Australia, and Ember's two analysts on the call, Dr. Denita Setiawati in Jakarta and Neshwin Rodriguez in India. And thank you for joining us. If you're interested in following this, do keep logging on to our Twitter feed, or our X feed, as I should say, or following us on LinkedIn. We do have some resources coming out in the near future on clean flexibility, and it's an area we're going to be looking at more over the course of next year. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to be with you.